Continuing with our discussion of Iranian politics in the immediate aftermath of the coup, the next important period is 1957. It's an important period because it marks the establishment of Iran's secret police under the Shah called Savak. And Savak was created in order to give the Shah internal control over the dissidents and people who would challenge him, realizing that in order to have a viable dictatorship in an era that is rapidly becoming or moving toward mass politics, you do need to have the secret police to keep ahead of the dissidents. It is also important for you to know that the training of the secret police in Iran was done by the Israelis and the Americans. In fact, Shah went to Israel and wanted help for the training. And that's one of the reasons there is such a strong anger on the part of the Iranian clerics about Israel, because when you look back in history, you see that Israel had no reservation whatsoever in helping a dictator to teach them the torture techniques to suppress their own people. Also, Americans were involved in training the CIA. I don't know how much the Americans were involved in the torture part of it, but certainly with the intelligence part of it. So we are now pretty much following the British footstep because we have a client state, so to speak, in the Shah of Iran, and we want to make sure he maintains control. I do want to say that when you think about secret police, remember that they become the main pillars of any modern dictatorship. In the ancient period, you really didn't need to have a secret police because most of the intrigues were done at the court level and by the elites. But as you move toward mass politics, you will need secret police if you want to maintain a dictatorial regime. So with the establishment of Savak, Shah is now a modern dictator, and it's anticipating Iran's move toward mass politics. The next period that is of importance is 1963. The Shah launches what he calls a white revolution in an attempt to kind of preempt, if you like, other kinds of revolution that could accompany reactions to dictatorial regime and part of the change process. The Shah decides to do that because he realizes that his alliance with the traditional elites is not going to be as helpful as aligning instead with the upcoming and rising bourgeoisie. So in a sense, the white revolution is an attempt by the Shah to first appear progressive, second, to change his base of support from that of the land-owning elites to the more bourgeoisie, middle-class, urban population. And also, in the words of eminent Iranian historian Reverend Ebrahimian, the white revolution was designed to avert a red one, but he notes right afterwards, it was one that actually paved the way for an Islamic revolution. So you got this irony that the white revolution from above, designed to prevent a communist revolution, but in fact paved the way for an Islamic one. The reaction to revolution on the part of Iranian clerics was very swift, and it was under the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a word that a lot of Americans know about because of the hostage crisis and the Iranian Revolution. He decided that this is going too far in terms of turning Iran into a Western kind of a country ignoring its own religious tradition. So Khomeini challenged the Shah, and there was religious uprising from the city of Qom, and the Shah had no other option but to crush that uprising. In fact, one could reasonably argue that the only major challenge that Shah receives from this point onward to his rule until the revolution that overthrew him was this uprising in 1963. So the White Revolution comes immediately under fire from the religious group, but the Shah's coercive power is too strong for these group to be able to stop the Shah, and they actually get crushed. And in 1964, Ayatollah Khomeini, who still remains unsubdued, is released from the jail, but then very quickly he is exiled to first Turkey, and later he goes to the city of Najaf in Iraq. And if you remember now, Iraq is a majority Shiite, so he went into the Shiite city of Najaf. And that's all we hear from Ayatollah Khomeini, at least in Iran, except of course for the religious circles who obviously were in contact with him. But as far as the news media is concerned, you don't hear any more or very much about Ayatollah Khomeini until 1978. So from 1963 onward, the Shah is pretty much remains unchallenged. The next event that I want to talk about is 1971. The Shah feels that Iran has advanced sufficiently far enough in the direction of the West. In other words, Iran has become sufficiently westernized, and for Shah, West was ultimately the symbol of civilization. And here you see again a conflict in the worldview between that of a Shah and Ayatollah Khomeini, who does not regard West as the symbol of civilization. So in 1971, the Shah decides to celebrate the 2.5 millennium of the founding of the Persian Empire by the Cyrus the Great. So what this hopefully will do for Shah, if you recall, he always had this issue, and he was fully aware of it, of legitimacy. So he's trying to now celebrate Iran's history and attach himself, sort of piggyback on that history to achieve a legitimacy that he has sorely lacked. So for him, this marked the 2.5 millennium of uninterrupted monarchy, his monarchy being the last one. The celebration are criticized in Iran by the dissident group, but in the West is seen as one more symbol of Iran becoming increasingly westernized, and the Shah had invited all the major leaders of the world to participate in this very lavish celebration, very expensive one. And of course, it was a very controversial move on the part of the Shah. The next phase is the 1973-74 energy crisis. And here, the energy crisis, those of you who recall or you have read about, was precipitated by the decision on the part of Egypt to attack Israel and try to win back their land that was occupied after the 1967 Arab-Israeli war. So the Arabs actually coordinated that attack, and Saudi Arabia decided to, for the first time, use the oil as a weapon, and it placed an embargo on the United States, who was supporting Israel. Shah decided that he's going to come and look like the nice guy, and he decided to, in fact, increase Iran's oil production to supply the West and to undermine the Arab oil embargo. And needless to say, he became the darling of the United States for doing so, and we thought that he was definitely a responsible, moderate leader. And in fact, more than that, this man was a world leader. And so Shah managed to further improve his own status in the outside world, and that really didn't do that much, again, for inside Iran. One of the unanticipated bonanzas that came from the oil embargo was that it led to the quadrupling of the oil prices. And that additional income really began to make a difference, and suddenly Iran became a very wealthy country compared to what it was before this quadrupling. And so a lot of public works projects began to be undertaken by the Shah, and Iran was using the oil money. Some of it obviously went for the Shah, and for the regime was a corrupt one in many ways, but sufficient amount was spent on public works and various projects that it began to have an impact. I would go even on a limb to say that probably in 1976, one could, that's a good date to choose to claim that Shah had reached the peak of his power at that point. There was a lot of money. Iran was awash with money, although nowhere as much as you would find in places that are much smaller, like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, because Iran was at that time about 33 million in population. But nevertheless, there was a lot of money, and so everything looked perfect for the Shah. Things were going well, and with that much money, Iran was making steady progress, quote unquote, toward becoming a modern state. And then all of a sudden, in 1978, you get this widespread popular discontent that turns into protest, and then eventually the protests begin to morph into a revolution. Now we can spend books and volumes on the causes of the revolution. Yet my own view on that is that this was a revolution that probably shouldn't have happened. It happened because of a number of fortuitous events. One was, of course, the way the Shah managed the challenge to his rule. He proved to be both a weak leader and a brutal one at first. And that's it's a lethal combination of being weak and brutal at the same time. And the second thing was that Ayatollah Khomeini, who we mentioned earlier, is now emerging as the undisputed leader of the Iranian Revolution. When I say that revolution really was not inevitable, even though it's a historical fact, is perhaps I can best illustrate that by the following claim. Imagine you had somebody like Saddam Hussein ruling Iran at the time. Would the revolution have been as likely under his rule? My guess is that the answer to that question is no. The Shah was weak, and he had all of these powers at his disposal, but he really was nowhere as ruthless as Saddam Hussein. And at the end, he caved in. But it took about a year before that would happen. And also I should say that we have learned since the revolution that the Shah suffered from cancer, which a year and a half later would kill him, and that he was very depressed throughout the revolution. In a sense, he had lost the will to fight. And The brutality of it was really nowhere in terms of dealing with a revolution as you are seeing or hearing about the situation in Syria with even aerial bombardment. The troops were there. The Shah would make concessions to prove his vulnerability and his weakness, and then a few days later he would then start shooting a few people, but then again he would make concession. The rhythm of revolution is a lesson in how not to deal with uprising if you want to stay a dictator. So at the end he probably had lost his will to be a dictator. So in February 1st, 1979, the Shah's regime falls and you have a revolution succeeding in Iran. What I want to do next is to give you a graph that kind of depicts why this revolution ended up to be Islamic, why the leadership was Islamic and not secular. And probably the best way I can explain that, or at least make a case for it, is by looking at this graph. And the graph going to depict intersection of two very important trends in Iran. The first is the growth of political participation. In other words, the rise in political participation toward making Iran a mass political society. And the second is a kind of trend we have seen all over the world associated with the decline of religiosity. The decline in religiosity is accompanying change as more people become secular and the country becomes more modern. The fascinating phenomena is this. If you look at the rates of the decline in religiosity, you see a small change, so that by the time of the revolution, about 30% of the Iranian, my guess is, would be truly secular. So the rate of decline of religiosity is close to being an arithmetic rate. By contrast, if you look at the growth of political participation, in other words, people who are now inclined to participate, people who no longer take government as just somebody, some entity that's there. They have expectations that they want the government to meet and to satisfy. When you look at that, the rate of growth is much closer to a geometric rate. So by the time these two trends intersect, the newly politically participant masses of Iran, these are people that have much closer identity with the religious leaders than they would have with the urban population and with the secular movement. So it shouldn't surprise you if this depiction is reasonably accurate, that the revolution would be dominated. The values that they would push will be those of religious leaders rather than the secular leaders. So once again, the rate of decline in religiosity in Iran was proceeding at something like an arithmetic rate, whereas the rate of political participation was growing at a geometric rate. So the newly politically participant, their values was much more traditional on religion. When you go back here in the 1 to 2%, these are the people who were also secular. So down here you have more of the political participant being secular, whereas up here in later time from 78 onward, you will see that most of the people are not secular. Also notice the period from around 1950 to 1980. This is a period of accelerated change under the Shah. So Shah, in a sense, was responsible for bringing Iran into mass politics, and yet the irony was he would be the last reigning monarch. The changes he started would ultimately bring him down.